Hi folks, I wanted to talk a little bit today about manual exposure in photography. Now you may ask, why in the world would I want to do manual photography when pretty much everything is automated these days? Well, manual exposure gives you a whole new dimension of your photography and lets you be just a little bit more creative. So you may come across something called the exposure triangle. Now the exposure triangle is basically the relationship between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And if you go online and look at the charts and graphs and things like that, you'll basically see a bunch of numbers facing each other and nothing really tells you anything. It's kind of confusing. So I thought I'd come out here today with a completely manual film camera. And I'm doing this because on a manual camera like this, I can show you a little bit better about how everything works, how it relates to each other, and things like that. Now, we'll get into ISO after a while. I don't really feel like ISO is that important. It's mostly aperture and shutter speed. So we'll get into ISO in a minute. But first, let's start with the main controls of aperture and shutter speed. Looking at the top of our camera, we have a couple different controls that allow us to affect how the photo actually looks. We have an aperture ring, and that allows us to control the depth of field. We also have a shutter speed dial, and that allows us to control the actual timing of the exposure. In using manual exposure, if you want to keep the same exposure, you can't really change one thing without changing the other. This is called reciprocity. It's the relationship between the aperture and the shutter speed. Let's say we get a meter reading of 125th of a second at f16. If we want to change the aperture so that we get more depth of field, let's say to f22, we also have to compensate for that because we've made the hole of the aperture smaller, so therefore there's less light going through the camera and hitting the sensor. So now we have to compensate here by turning the shutter speed a one-stop difference and allowing more light to actually hit the sensor. We do that by going to a 60th of a second now at f22. This is the same exact exposure as 125th at f16. Now let's go the other way. Let's say we want to change our shutter speed to try and get more action stopped. So on this camera, our fastest shutter speed is 1/1000th of a second. That is 1, 2, 3 stops from where we were. So we now have to change the aperture by opening up and letting more light through because we've shortened our time by 3 stops. So now we have to again compensate by opening up 3 stops. That will be f11, 8, and finally 5.6. Now we have the actual shutter speed that we want, but less depth of field. It's all about give and take. Exposure is a lot like pouring water into a glass. You can let the light dribble in very slowly over a long period of time, or you can let a whole lot of light in a very short period of time. Either way, you end up with a full glass of water. So on most digital cameras, you can find the aperture and shutter speed dials somewhere on the camera. Like this one is the shutter speed on the very top of the camera. and then I have a big dial in the back that controls the aperture. Right now I have it set at 125th of a second at f/16. If I move the shutter speed up and down, you can see it has some different numbers than the manual camera has. These are in third stops. Now with digital cameras, you can set them in all different ways. I have mine set at third stop increments. You can also set them at a half stop or full stops, whatever's easiest for you. Same thing with the aperture. These are not always, the full stops. So, f/16, we have 18, 20, 22. So those are in third stops. If we go down to, let's say if I need 2 stops difference here, I would go down to f/11 and then down to f/8. So it basically works the same. It's just different types of ways of controlling it.
So what actually happens when you trip the shutter button? First, the aperture blades close down to their chosen setting. Then the mirror swings up and out of the way, and the shutter opens, exposing the film or sensor to the light.
So what about ISO, and how does that figure into figuring out our exposure? Well, ISO is the sensitivity of your sensor in your digital camera, and you can adjust it by lower numbers or higher numbers. Now, let's say that you're trying to take a picture of some sort of action thing, like maybe an animal or something, and you're in very low light. And let's say your aperture is all the way wide open as far as you can possibly go. And you've cranked your shutter speed up as fast as you can go to try and stop the action, and yet it's still not enough. This is where ISO comes in. You can then bump your ISO up several stops or more to try and get more stops of light in. This enables you to make the sensor more sensitive, and then you can use faster shutter speeds. So you're open as far as you can be on your aperture, and your shutter speed can then be dialed up to get faster and faster shutter speeds. So in that way it works to get more shutter speed out of it. However, it does come with a cost. As with everything in photography, it's kind of a give and take, and the higher the number ISO you're using, the more the quality is going to suffer. You start getting more noise, more grain, and so therefore I usually try and start out as low as I can possibly go and then work my way up as needed. Well, I hope this video has helped a few people in understanding some of the basics about manual exposure. We'll dive into a few other things later as far as how to meter and what your meter is actually doing and things like that. So until next time, thanks for watching. See you later.